The objective: to deliver the NBA to you like no other. News, play breakdowns, power rankings, storylines you never hear talked about anywhere else. It's all straight shots here, fired by straight shooters. S and Gunn. This is the Objective Basketball Podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Objective Basketball Podcast. Good morning if you're listening to this in the morning. Good afternoon if you're listening to this in the afternoon. And Lauren, I have to ask you, it is a hectic day for you because it is lottery day. Technically, when we are listening to this, it is I hope this is lottery day. I assume this is being released on Tuesday. So I'm going to go ahead and say it's lottery day. Real quick, are you hopeful as a Mavericks fan that you end up keeping that pick?
Heck yeah, I'm hopeful. I mean, right now it's so bizarre because it's like, even if they keep the pick at 10, and that's the most likely scenario, Mavs fans are feeling great. It's a loaded draft. Next year, that's the pick that then gets sent to New York, and it's not even close to as loaded of a draft. And so from a Mavs perspective, that is plenty good. And you know, the odds of jumping into the top four, also very realistic. I want to say it's like 20 something percent. So, but there's also that 20% that you lose it. So it's going to be a whirlwind of a night. It's only like a 30-minute program, I feel like, but my brother is driving in. We're going to watch it together, and we're very optimistic, but also aware that there's a very real possibility that we are left in a world of hurt. In a world of hurt.
There's a doomsday scenario. There's definitely a doomsday scenario. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm going to a Jays game, and I'm going to be watching the draft lottery while they're doing their pitches and all that stuff. It's actually, so I heard it was Looney Dog Day, which you don't know what a loony is. A loony is what they call $1 here in Canada.
Oh, nice.
Yes. So $1 hot dog, I'm going to be chilling.
You're going to be chilling.
17. Okay?
That sounds amazing.
And then also be enjoying the draft lottery during the Jays game. So that's what I'm going to be doing, ladies and gentlemen.
Nice.
If this drops on Monday, imagine we're talking about Tuesday. Okay. A very, very busy weekend for the NBA. Incredibly busy weekend. And since we last talked to you guys, there have been 4 teams that have been eliminated. The Sixers, the Suns, the Warriors, the Knicks. It's a lot to go through. And quite frankly, there's just not enough time for us to be able to go in depth on a lot of these. And plus, you know, this is off-season conversation. For the most part, I think we are going to go in depth on a lot of these teams moving forward, especially when, you know, once the finals are done. We can do more previews of what we expect some of these teams to do. But real quick, I want to start it off with the Philadelphia 76ers, who got absolutely embarrassed in Game 7 against the Celtics in Boston. Jason Tatum scored the most points ever in a Game 7, which broke Curry's record literally 2 weeks ago. It's incredible that I thought that Pantheon level performance from Steph was going to be cemented forever. No one was ever going to touch it, but like, it would be difficult to, and then Tatum just goes ahead and does it. Maybe a little bit of inflation because it was a blowout, but regardless, the Sixers are done. There are tons of questions moving forward for them and what they do. Doc Rivers, there's the questions of him if he's going to be a coach. We've talked about James Harden, the overall pressure of this team sort of being at the end of the road when it comes to how many iterations of this, how many kicks at the can the Sixers have really done in terms of like just going for it, right? There's been so many iterations of this team. You think about the Jimmy Butler days, and then it was Ben and Joel, and that completely failed out. And then you have the Harden and Embiid. And yeah, there is, I think you can look at this, Lauren, and say like, I can see the Sixers running it back with Embiid and Harden, a new coach, maybe trying to refine the roster a little bit by making some fringe moves, looking to maybe move a Tobias Harris, maybe packaging, and try to find some other better rotation players around that team. But ultimately, I do feel like the process is dead. And I don't know how much they want to really start over, how much they want to gut this thing out. And I mean, and I'm not saying like as far as trading Joel Embiid, who is the MVP of this league, but it does beg to question, like, what kind of a roster are you able to boast around around Embiid if James Harden decides to leave, if Doc Rivers is no longer the coach? So I'm kind of worried if I would be if I'm a Sixers fan, I would be genuinely worried about what the future of this team is, and if Joel Embiid and James Harden and Doc Rivers are a part of it. I don't think Doc is a part of it. I imagine maybe even by the time this podcast is out that we hear the news that Doc Rivers is probably not going to be the Sixers coach next year.
Right.
But where do you sit on what Philly is doing right now and where they sit heading into the summer?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because the biggest conversation that's being had is James Harden. And from a Philly perspective, I would imagine that they feel pretty confident that they will be able to retain him. I could be completely wrong. This could be a let's look like idiots preview, I guess, for down the line. But I do feel like they have an MVP. They were this close to the Eastern Conference Finals, and I bet would feel that if they had made it to the finals, they would ultimately be the NBA championship, be the champions this year. But I feel like,
well, let's actually, this was their best shot.
I agree. I agree. This was their best shot.
Like, you have Milwaukee's eliminated. You are up 3-2 in the series. If you win this series, you have home court advantage for the rest of the playoffs. I think this was their opportunity. And I think that lends its hand to the whole aspect of it being done. Like, if this
that's fair.
Couldn't be capitalized on, how much more can you really invest into this to make it, possible next year? I just, that's the part that makes me question it.
Yeah. As they kind of shift and look towards the offseason, I do still feel confident that they will try to keep James Harden. And if you're James Harden, I mean, very difficult to predict. But yeah, there's the Houston connection and there's the questions there. But from where he's at and the criticism that he's gotten, and the biggest one right now is, man, you and your right-hand man, you guys both dropped the ball in this game 7 a lot and are taking a lot of the blame. And so James Harden has had some phenomenal performances this playoffs. And so for those to kind of get overshadowed by this last game, that's going to be the narrative moving forward. And so for him to kind of bounce back and be in a position to contend for a title, going to Houston is not going to give him that. He's not going to have that reality, especially with what may happen in the draft lottery. If the Rockets land Wemby or even or in that second spot and look at Scoot, I don't really know that they're going to be full steam ahead on James Harden. And so there's a world in which the Houston connection just completely fizzles out, which is why I feel that Philadelphia has confidence that they'll be able to retain him as they look forward. Tobias Harris being on that final deal. I mean, for so long, we've been talking about how much of a terrible contract is, but we've seen, Russell Westbrook, Kevin Love in the past, some of these massive, it's movable. And it's also, there are going to be situations around the league where teams are trying to move money. They're trying to get something going. I mean, even you could even throw Dallas in there as a potential, hey, we could try and get someone in who can just shot create. And so there are going to be options for them to move Tobias Harris. It's really just what they're willing to do. So I do think that they have options, but right now hanging on to the core of Embiid, Maxey, and then operating under the assumption that James Harden will be staying, I think that there are pathways forward. I do agree with you that this was their shot, but if you're Philadelphia and you're trying to get that much closer to a championship and you feel like Joel Embiid is your guy, then you have no option but to move forward and say, okay, what do? We run it back. We tweak the coaching, which to me, there's no debate there. That's happening.
Yeah.
And then you do try to retool, trim around the edges and kind of fit some things in there. So I think a guy like Shake Milton is someone who in the past has been very valuable off their bench, but then you bring in DeAnthony Melton and he kind of fades away a little bit. So I think that they have options to try and get out there and move some pieces. But I think it's going to kind of be these around the fringes moves that they hope kind of build and round out a roster with the way kind of what we're seeing with Denver. Try to build a more Denver-like roster, even though they function very differently. I think that's their way, as opposed to trying to hope that a third mega star comes available and you try to do a Tyrese Maxey. I do not think that is the path for the Philadelphia 76ers.
I also think that's not possible anymore, given the CBA implications moving forward. I just think it's really hard to consider yourself a financially flexible team, but also a team that's able to build a roster around 3 super max or max players.
Right.
It just becomes so much harder now moving forward into this next CBA. And that's why there's so much pressure on, the Suns, the Warriors, the Bucks, the Clippers, those second attacks, the second apron teams to be able to how are we going to maneuver through this thing? Because it's going to be more hard to keep those increasingly expensive superstars on your roster. Okay, there's much more that we have to get to, so I'll keep it moving. I agree with you, though. I do think Harden will stay. I think a lot of this is a leverage play, and I think Houston is playing the leverage game as well with Harden. They're sort of willing to let him do that. I think the ultimate goal here is to get Harden to sign on a long-term deal, and for the Sixers to be willing to sign Harden to a long-term deal. He's an older player, right? He's had moments where he's looked great, but moments where he's looked terrible, and there's questions of age and mileage and all that stuff. So I think it's just a leverage play at this point. I really do not think he ends up in Houston. I think it just doesn't make sense from a roster building standpoint for the Rockets either. So moving forward from the Sixers, again, we will talk about these teams more in depth moving forward in the offseason. Want to get your thoughts on the Golden State Warriors. They are eliminated as well. They got eliminated on Friday against the Los Angeles Lakers. The Lakers are moving to the Western Conference Finals. We'll talk about them in our preview in a couple of minutes. But I guess the overall sense that I'm getting from the reports that came out from Shams Charania, some of the stuff that's detailing what will happen, is that they're running it back. That Draymond, that Klay Thompson, that Steph Curry, those guys will be back. Steve Kerr will be back. The only domino here is Bob Myers. Everybody is wondering, and for the people who may not know, Bob Myers is I don't want to call him a mastermind, but he is at the helm of what this Warriors team has built. You know, he's the president of basketball operations, the GM, the guy who has really been able to fine-tune this roster. He has a very deep-seated connection with the Warriors trio. So that's a huge domino to fall for this Warriors team. And then who takes his place? Who has that type of bravado? Who can be able to also be able to negotiate contract extensions for Klay Thompson and Draymond Green, because those guys are probably going to need to take pay cuts for the Warriors to be able to build this roster out to be better. I think there are some other avenues the Warriors can take. I mean, despite what we say about the young guys and how unsuccessful this 2 timeline thing has been, because really it has been unsuccessful. James Wiseman has flailed out. He's in Detroit now. Jordan Poole looked like he was awesome last year, and now, you know, there may be questions about what his real ceiling is. Jonathan Kuminga had a very, very good year, and I think for the most part, people are high on Jonathan Kuminga. But again, there's questions of that. I still think, though, that they have enough in terms of the young guys, in terms of Jonathan Kuminga, in terms of Jordan Poole, maybe even including a Moses Moody, that could go ahead and get them not another star, but I think that could help them round out their roster a little bit more, fine-tune it. One of the biggest issues for the Warriors, it came up in that Lakers series, it came up throughout the season, was their lack of size. Yes, they had Kevon Looney. Yes, they had Draymond Green, but they really didn't have another big that could be versatile for them. You know, a guy that came to mind for me is like, hey, if you got Miles Turner on the Warriors, you could have run so many different things. And when it gets to this point in the playoffs, when you're one of the final 8 teams, it is about how versatile you can be, how much you can change on the dime, how much you can really flip things around. And the Warriors aren't too far away. Steph Curry, you know, just last round looked like the best player in the world, right? He was awesome throughout the series as well. They still have Klay Thompson, and even though he dropped a bunch of duds in that Lakers series, you're still confident in him because he looked great during the regular season. Draymond Green, for all his faults, is still an incredible defensive player. The nucleus is there. Andrew Wiggins, you know, Kevon Looney, these are trusted guys that have won an NBA championship. I really don't think the Warriors are that far away, and I don't think they are that limited flexibility-wise to be able to maneuver this thing. The main key thing is figuring out contract extensions for Klay and Draymond, and that's why the Bob Myers domino is the biggest thing to fall, because that's the guy who can probably convince them to take a pay cut. So where do you sit on the Warriors? I went on a little bit of a spiel there, but where do you sit?
It was great. It was great. I am right there with you that they are close. The biggest thing is the Bob Myers of it all, but also the Steve Kerr extension. I think that is something that will inevitably happen. And I do expect the nucleus of Draymond, Klay, and Steph to obviously continue. I know that was a question for a little while with Andrew Wiggins and Jordan Poole, all that, but I do expect them to stay there even in the pay cut scenario. I'm glad you mentioned Miles Turner, because to me, that's how you keep this thing going. And I absolutely think that that's a realistic trade target for them, because if I know Jordan Poole had a rough year, whatever, but this man is he's 23 years old, and we've seen not even just glimpses, because there's a big enough sample size of what he can do. So a team like the Pacers, I mean,
I think there's a legitimate, like, from a team that's rebuilding, like, let's say the Pistons might be a bad example because they have so many guards, but
right.
a team that is like, hey, we're willing to take on a guy like that. I think there's
Yeah.
a legitimate opportunity for Jordan Poole to become like an all-star level player if he's
Absolutely.
given that level of opportunity. It's crazy to say because of how bad he looked throughout the season this year and obviously in the playoffs, but there is the potential there for a guy like that who gets downhill, who has the speed, who can score.
Yeah.
I mean, play make a little bit for you too. I think that is a possibility, and that's why teams will be interested regardless.
Absolutely. And I've seen some, oh, well, is it going to be difficult for them to trade him, that contract? But no, I don't think that there's going to be any problem trading him. And I think that is the path. I think you look at trading Jordan Poole and you look at the options of trading Jonathan Kuminga, whether that's together or separate, because I do think that there are realistic options out there. I think that there are conversations to be had. I don't know that they would materialize to anything, but I would be calling Cleveland saying, hey, do you feel like Evan Mobley can only reach his potential once Jared Allen is gone? Or do you want to stick with that duo? That, I think that's a question that the Golden State Warriors should be asking. I would ask Minnesota, how close are you to being done with Cat? And if that answer, if you want to keep him, is Rudy Gobert an option that the Warriors would even consider? And how would that look? I think that the key for the Warriors is finding this defensive anchor that helps kind of bridge the gap for when Steph is being targeted defensively, or just, I think that is what will help them extend this window. I think Miles Turner is the number one best case scenario for them, but I was playing around actually with trade packages today, and I came up with one that got the Pacers both Kuminga and Jordan Poole, and it's also worth noting that the Warriors have the 19th pick in this next draft, so in a loaded draft. So I expect the Warriors to go out and do something. The Rudy Gobert situation is very complex, and I don't know that I could see that materializing quickly. But if I'm them, I'm looking at all of the realistic options. Clint Capella is another one. All of the realistic defensive-minded anchors that could help extend this window to where, as Draymond gets older and injuries maybe become a little bit more frequent, they can rely on someone who's going to be durable and help protect the paint while still having a Kevon Looney, while still having youth in Gary Payton Jr. II, Dante DiVincenzo, still having guys that even Moses Moody. Moses Moody is someone that, even though he's on the kind of 2 double timeline, I could see them keeping him. And so that, I think that there are plenty of options for the Warriors, and people need to not count them out, even though they have a lot of questions going into the offseason, because they have a lot of pathways to get that final piece that they need.
I agree with you. And again, we're trying to go as quickly as possible on these teams. There's so much.
It's hard.
Yeah, there's so much that we can go ahead and break down for you guys. But again, it's just there's a lot going on, ladies and gentlemen. It's the NBA playoffs. Yes, by the way, it is the playoffs. Get in the game, make your bet. Make your next bet with Sports Interaction. Bet before the game or live and play on all your favorite teams' matchups. Head to sportsinteraction.com/SDPN or download the app to get started. 19 plus. Please play responsibly. Okay, so the next one we can do is Knicks, and I think that's a very, very quick thing, and then we can kind of go to the Suns, talk about the coaching carousel and everything that's happening there. The Knicks in general, I wasn't very surprised that they were eliminated on Friday. I think everybody was expecting them to. When it comes to what they look like moving forward, I think the one thing that they can hang their hat on is that the Jalen Brunson signing, and I'm sorry, it's to your demise, but the Jalen Brunson signing was a home run. It worked. It worked so well. He is going to bring a level of stability to that franchise that they haven't seen since the 70s, or since the 90s at the very least, right? That is what Jalen Brunson is going to do for this team. The questions around the roster, I think, are fair. I think whatever questions you have for Julius Randle is a very, very fair thing. But I do think they have an incredible amount of flexibility to work around this roster. Whenever that next star is ready, they are ready to pounce because it is New York. They have draft capital. They have these young guys in an RJ Barrett who look really good in the playoffs, in a Quentin Grimes, in an Emmanuel Quickly. And I think, above all else, short-term wise, you look at things like, okay, they're probably going to re-sign Josh Hart. They're probably going to run this whole thing back, maybe look to make some moves around the margin, definitely add some shooting. That was the biggest concern for them in that series. I think shooting was such a huge concern because they weren't able to space the floor enough for a guy like Brunson, for a guy like Randall. And then obviously you ask yourself about the Randle equation. What is out there for a guy like Julius Randle, who has now made a second All-NBA team, but has also been disappointing in the playoffs, and hasn't really lived up to the expectations that people expected him to have. So I think that's the overall conversation to have with the Knicks. There's nothing, too drastic. Nothing. There's not going to be any overarching changes. I think the major overarching, whatever.
Yeah.
I think the main thing here is that it was a win. This season was a win for the Knicks, and having Jalen Brunson moving forward, to me, he just reminds me so much of Kyle and what Kyle brought to the Raptors when he got here. You have a sense of calm when that guy is on your roster, and I think that's what the Knicks probably feel right now. Where do you sit on all things Knicks related?
I think for the most part, yeah, they're going to run it back, knowing that they'll re-sign Josh Hart. I think that's essentially all but done. I think they feel pretty good about where they're at. I'm looking at the Obi Toppin, the Julius Randle, the Mitchell Robinson even, because even though he was very solid, I think that there are some very real questions that could get brought to light at some point. And those are all pieces that you can move. I actually like them a lot as a John Collins destination. I could see that being something. I don't see Obi Toppin necessarily being there long term. So I think that that's something that could get interesting if they try to do some sort of Julius Randle swap or entertain something that way. I feel like they're going to pursue, they're going to feel out what they can get for some of these guys. And it will be a matter of, is that something that we're comfortable enough taking? I actually think that they're going to end up running it back and then maybe look down the line a little bit. I actually think that Karl Anthony Towns and the New York Knicks, I think that could be something that really materializes. So that's kind of what I'm keeping my eye on and why I expect them to, for the most part, run it back.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. The Knicks will always be players when it comes to whatever star ends up on the market next. So yeah, we'll see what happens. The Suns are the big kahuna to tackle offseason wise from the teams that are eliminated. I mean, the Sixers have tons of questions about them too, but there's just a level of intrigue with the Suns because of everything that's happened around them. The Kevin Durant trade, obviously the Matt Ishbia stuff and him taking over ownership wise. We don't know how he, from the reports that we've heard recently is that Ishbia is sort of taken control of the front office and he's kind of running the show. He's a one-man show in there. And I wonder, because there's no real track record of Ishbia being a GM or being a front office person, how that's going to move forward, how they're going to, tangibly change things. But the thing is, Monty Williams is out as coach after two embarrassing elimination losses. He has been, let go of his duties. I will say, I don't really think that this one in particular was Monty's fault. I think the Suns, we mentioned it 1,000,001 times on this podcast, but the Suns really weren't a team that was built to win this year. He was working with scrap pieces. Kevin Durant and Devin Booker were working with scrap pieces. DeAndre Ayton was out and, essentially didn't show up for a lot of that series. Chris Paul was hurt. I think there's a lot of other factors that played into the Suns being, eliminated in very, very embarrassing fashion. So I don't think it was Monty Williams' fault. And I also think that Monty Williams is probably going to be one of the most, if not the most sought out coach in this coaching carousel. So I think this is where we can tackle what will happen in Phoenix is this coaching carousel and what will happen moving forward. I think the roster stuff is stuff we've talked about before, where it's like, hey, they don't have tons of maneuvering that they can do flexibility wise. We'll see what happens with DeAndre Ayton. We'll see what happens with Chris Paul. And we talked about that in the last podcast and what that could be. But I think the next thing to look at for this is the coaching carousel. It's Monty Williams. Where is he going to go? Who will the Suns end up hiring? So I've got a list of coaching spots that are open right now. Toronto Raptors, Phoenix Suns, Milwaukee Bucks, Detroit Pistons, potentially the Philadelphia 76ers, potentially the Los Angeles Clippers. And then you have the coaches that are on the market right now. Nick Nurse, Monty Williams, Mike Budenholzer. Frank Vogel is a name that's been mentioned a few times as a previous championship winning coach. And then you have all of the assistants, all of the guys and girls, and even Becky Hammon, who has been considered in this, next wave of coaches. So there's tons of coaches that are available, some really, really big names out there. Where do you see them landing? Because there are openings and there are other teams that, we can start with Phoenix first if you want. Where do you think?
Yeah, let's start with Phoenix.
Who do you think gets them?
JJ Redick. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. But I do feel like it will be Nick Nurse. I think Nick Nurse makes sense. I think a lot of the conversations that were being had about Kevin Durant to Toronto, I think that there could be some familiarity and some power to Kevin Durant's weight in that decision. I think it makes sense. I'm having a lot of trouble with Bud going there, and I'm having a lot of trouble with pretty much every other name that's out there. I personally was surprised that Monty was let go, because even considering the previous years, I mean, what we've said, I think it's more of a roster problem, not a coaching problem, especially given the relationships that he has and the trust that he has with those guys. So I'm still scratching my head a little bit on that one, but that's the way it goes. I like Nick Nurse for Phoenix, and I'm just going to throw it out there. I like Monty Williams in Philadelphia.
Yeah, I think Monty Williams will be sought out in the Eastern Conference. I think Philadelphia.
I think it'll be Philly or Milwaukee.
Yeah, the Bucks. I think the Raptors will go hard on him too, because Monty Williams is a coach, and I've tweeted this a bunch, but it's very, very hard to assess coaching. It's very much so a black box. 99.9% of people don't know what goes into coaching consistently. They also can't assess coaching consistently because they're not in the locker room. They're not seeing how a coach interacts with every single player. They're not seeing what the coach is technically responsible for, how much they lean on their assistants. Some of that stuff is so ambiguous that we are kind of just throwing stuff at the wall and hoping it sticks, and also just forming these narratives about these coaches in real time. In terms of Monty Williams, though, there are some things that can be said. He's a culture setter. He's a guy who built up the Suns into what they were. He built this family environment, if you will. Obviously there were tons of quotes and like these motivational moments that he's had in the Suns locker room. But I really do think that's important for a young team. So I think there will be teams that look at that and say, hey, if we need someone who is a rally the troops type of guy, this Monty Williams is the guy. And also, he brought a level of fluidness to the Suns offense. Before the Kevin Durant trade, they were at the top of the league, near the top of the league when it came to assists. They shared the ball. They were an unselfish basketball team. They moved. It was a motion-heavy offense. It was very similar to what the Warriors do, honestly. And I think that goes without saying that is huge for a team like Philadelphia, who is a very isolation-heavy team and maybe could use that ball movement a little. Or Milwaukee, who has consistently struggled to score in the half court. Or Toronto, which definitely desperately needs, one, a culture reset, and two, some offensive structure. So I really think he's going to be the most sought out coach.
Yeah.
Shams Charania reported that he is not going to be jumping into the saddle immediately. He's going to take a little bit of time and assess his situation and, talk to his family and see what happens from there. And then they'll move forward and we'll see what happens. I agree though. I will say,
I want to add, if Philadelphia, I cannot have a Doc Rivers Chris Paul reunion. That is not the answer. And if that narrative starts getting brought up, like, oh, here's an idea. Here's not even like this is what they need to do. This is a suggestion. But if that's just even thrown out as a possibility, that is just not the answer. The answer.
Yeah, I agree. And it'll be interesting where Doc Rivers goes once that happens. I mean, I think he's someone who will be sought out, but I'm also curious if how much people kind of stay away considering the whole playoff stuff and everything like that. I don't know. Okay, so look, Phoenix probably goes. Also, another player in the Phoenix situation is Ty Lue, because he's number one on the Suns list for replacing him. Right. And I'm very curious to see if the Clippers will let the Suns do that. I think if you're sending him off to another team in the Western Conference that you're competing with and you're both trying to be playoff teams, I just feel like that doesn't make tons of sense.
Yeah, even in the same division, like it's a little too close.
Exactly. I feel like if anything, the Suns wanting Ty Lue will make the Clippers want to keep Ty Lue even more.
Right.
So I feel like, I would be surprised if the Clippers let go of Ty Lue. Yeah. So there's other coaching spots other than Phoenix. We can go through them later in another episode doing podcast stuff, but it would be very interesting to see where the Suns go direction wise. I mean, they have a very, very interesting offseason moving forward, but ladies and gentlemen, it is playoff time. It is conference finals time. There are only 4 teams left. It's it's a weird time in the NBA world when it's only the 4 teams, because it's a game every night, one single game every night. You start to hear the rumblings of, off-season talk, the rumors, because most teams are eliminated. 26 teams are done, and they can still, make trades. They can still maneuver around. They can still talk to their players and whatnot. So it's a weird time, but also it's a very interesting time for basketball. So we wanted to preview the conference finals. Which way do you want to go first? You want to go East or West?
Let's go East first.
Okay. All right. So look, the Celtics punched their ticket to the Eastern Conference Finals last night. It's going to be Sixers. No, it's not going to be Sixers. It's going to be Celtics versus Heat for the 3rd time in 4 seasons. A rematch of the NBA bubble, a rematch of the bubble throughout the conference finals, by the way. Lakers Nuggets was also the 2020 conference finals in the West. So I guess for me, there's a couple of things that pop out. I have a list of 5 here, and maybe we can go through a couple of them and just see.
Perfect.
The number one thing is Jimmy Butler. Jimmy Butler has been incredible against the Celtics every single time he's faced them. I mean, even last year when they faced off in the conference finals, it was one Jimmy Butler shot away from the Heat being in the finals instead of the Celtics. That's how good Jimmy is. He has been able to will this team, and he's done so throughout these playoffs, into playoff series. He's been able to make them be a part of the conversation. And I also think that will be a factor here in this playoff series. Yeah, through all the metrics, through all the numbers, through all the things that we saw in the regular season and probably in the playoffs, the Celtics should be favored by a large margin in this series. But if there's one thing that will make it close, that will make it so that this series isn't a 5-game series, maybe even a 6-game series, it's Jimmy Butler. I really do think that he has some kind of an edge when he plays the Celtics, and they, struggle against a guy like him. So I'm very interested to see what happens. I think Jimmy is the guy, though, that will differentiate. The other thing is, the Heat shooting. They were an incredible shooting team to start this playoffs. They've kind of, tinkered down. They've settled down a little bit. They've come back down to earth in terms of the shooting. How important that is against a Celtics team that relies on the 3-point shot, that loves the math battle. Joe Mazzulla has mentioned this time and time again, that he wants the Celtics to shoot a bunch of threes in games, and they hit a bunch of threes in games as well. So I just think the math battle will be very, very interesting in this series. How many threes the Heat will be able to make, how they will be able to match the Celtics offensively. And then the other side of that equation is the Heat defense, because we know what the Celtics can do. I mean, we saw it in Game 7 against the Sixers. We know what they can do defensively when they're locked in. We also know what the Heat can do defensively when they're locked in. They run the most zone out of any team in the NBA. They're very, very comfortable switching their scheme. Eric Spoelstra is a mastermind when it comes to the coaching stuff, and I think that will be a very, very big key in this series, coaching-wise, between the rookie in Joe Mazzulla and the veteran, the more experienced coach in Eric Spoelstra. But the question here is, how can the Heat make those 3-point shots very, very difficult for the Celtics? Are you going to chase out to shooters? Are you going to be closing out? How much are you going to go to that zone that is going to essentially bank on the Celtics missing their shots? I think these are the things that are kind of, I'm wrapping my mind around it. I'm supposed to be writing my conference finals previews all day today, so I'll see what happens and I'll go into the numbers. But those are sort of the overarching, there goes that word again, overarching themes I can think of for a Heat Celtics preview. Where do you lie? What's your, I guess you can go with a prediction if you want, but like, how do you think this series plays out?
God, I mean, talk about probably the most unpredictable team in the playoffs so far has been the Miami Heat. And so it's I still am, even after this Knicks series, I'm having trouble pinpointing what their true ceiling is and trajectory. But I think for Miami, you feel confident about the momentum that you've built, the hope that Tyler Hero could return soonish. And just knowing, like you mentioned, the history of how Jimmy plays against Boston and knowing that he's getting, like, they're close. Miami, they're exceeding expectations, but they're not just doing that. They're getting close to their goal. And so it's difficult to pinpoint how the series is going to go. I still lean Boston. I mean, I think a lot of people have favored whoever was going to come out of the Boston Philly series and has even picked Boston to be in the Eastern Conference Finals and also potentially, or maybe even likely, the NBA champion. And so I still lean Boston, like you mentioned, because of all the numbers, because of the depth, because of the versatility. But I still have big questions about Boston mishandling games as a whole sometimes, how they can I will just be watching them and I'll be left like, what am I watching? This is not what I would view as to be like a championship pedigree, ready for the moment team. And then other nights it's like, oh my goodness, like yesterday. And so when you have those sort of inconsistencies and you have someone like Jimmy Butler who is ready to jump on any opportunity, it's very difficult to predict with a certain degree of certainty or
certain degree of certainty.
I was like, well, that ain't right, is it? But so I don't quite know how this is going to go, but I think Jimmy and Miami, they're not going to go down without a fight. And so I think it's going to be a long series. I don't think it's going to be a 5-game. Boston is so dominant. That would really, really surprise me if that's the way it went.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also think the other factor here with the Heat is just Bam. The front court battle is going to be so huge. I mean, what the Celtics did to the Sixers was that they started Robert Williams, and now you have Robert Williams and Al Horford starting, and that double big front court was so massive for Philly, and it was tough for them to get anything going offensively, especially towards the rim. I think that will be a big task for Bam to draw out, those big guys to make it so that, on these dribble handoffs where it's at the top of the key or on these like kind of makeshift plays that they do at the side with Bam and another guard. I think those are the types of things that will really, really open up this Heat offense. How aggressive Bam looks to get downhill, to score in the paint, to be able to look for his own shot. I mean, it's always a key for the Miami Heat, but I feel like it's even more of a key in this series. The reason, if we look back at 2020 and the bubble, the reason the Heat ended up winning that series against the Celtics was because of the incredible work of Bam Adebayo. Bam was incredible in the bubble, absolutely unreal. The defense, the rim protection. I mean, everybody remembers the famous block on Jason Tatum in the conference finals, but the fact that he was such a towering presence in the middle for them is what made it so that they could win that series. I think that's what he'll need to be in this series again. That's to me, it seems like Bam is the key to a lot of this for the Heat to be able to keep this thing together. I agree with you. I don't think it's going to be a short series. I would be very shocked if one of these teams lose in 5. I think it goes 6 minimum, with maybe, the potential of a game 7 again. And we'll see what happens from there. I mean, hey, these teams have had a long history against each other. Jimmy has played these guys multiple times. I mean, like I said, 3 times in the last 4 seasons.
That's crazy.
It really is unfathomable to consider. The other thing I would consider just to mention is the guard play between these two teams. When you look at, the Celtics obviously have Malcolm Brogdon, Marcus Smart, Derek White. And then on the Heat, you have Gabe Vincent, Kyle Lowry. I think those are like the dog level of those 5 guards that I just mentioned is incredible. The amount of hustle that you'll see, the amount of defensive versatility that you see, how important they look at, how good they look at the point of attack when it comes to defending the ball is going to be a huge thing in this series. How healthy Kyle Lowry looks. I mean, Kyle looks great in the playoffs so far, but he's going to be even more important in this series. How the Heat use Kevin Love as a floor spacer, as a guy who's, going to be crashing the offensive glass and rebounding for them. That's going to be a huge thing. So there's a lot of factors when it comes to this Celtics Heat series. I'm not going to go out and say that I think the Heat can win it. I think the advantage lies with the Celtics right now. That there's no question in that. Right. I think you simulate this series 100 times. I would probably say 80 times, maybe 75 times. I would say 80 times. 80 times the Celtics win this series. And that is despite the inconsistencies and the kind of ebbs and flows that we've seen, as you mentioned, from the Celtics team, where they gave the Sixers life. The Sixers look lost in the wind for a lot of that series. and yet still they managed to force a Game 7. The same thing happened in the first round against the Hawks, where it just seemed like the Hawks were lost and really didn't know what was going to happen, and the Hawks pushed it to 6. So, like, I do think that is a question with the Celtics, is the playing with your food aspect of things. Maybe it's the rookie head coach and Joe Mazzulla. Maybe it's just like the shooting, the reliance on the shooting, and that will depend on how they're hitting their shots on any given night. But I think if I had to lean right now, I'm probably going Celtics in 6 or 7. Where do you lean on that?
I would say with a certain degree of confidence, which is what I meant to say a second ago.
Nice.
I would say Celtics in 6. I think 7 is.
Yeah.
I think a lot would really have to go in Miami's favor. Like you mentioned, Bam, Jimmy, the guard play. It would all Duncan Robinson shooting well. It would all have to be leaning their favor, and 7 is a little hard for me to envision. But then again, I have underestimated the Heat multiple times in the playoffs so far, and here they are. Yeah. So I would love for them.
I had the Knicks winning again. So
Me too. I said at the very beginning, Tyler Herro's out there. Zero chance they beat Milwaukee. 0. And here we are. So you never know. But yeah, it's going to be a good series. Like you said, the hustle, the dog play. I mean, it is going to be a fight, and it's going to be amazing. So I can't wait.
I'm very, very curious to see from a fan perspective, the drama of Jimmy versus the Celtics and all that stuff. I think it'll be a very fun series. It'll be a lot of fun to watch. And I think Jimmy is up for some pretty big performances. I'm going to lean Celtics in 6 or 7. I kind of want to give love to the Heat though, because I would not be surprised at all if the Heat ended up winning this series. Like, yes, it would be an upset, in some ways. Obviously, they're the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference. But I also wouldn't be surprised just because of how they've looked in these playoffs. Right. How incredible Kyle Lowry has looked. The Kevin Love addition has been awesome. The shooting, the Gabe Vincent has been, on fire. Bam has looked great, especially in that second round against the Knicks. Jimmy has looked like one of the best players in the playoffs this year. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Heat ended up winning the series. But Celtics in 6 or 7. Okay. Yeah. Nuggets and Lakers. Again, Bubbles rematch as well. On the surface of things, you look at it, you say, okay, Nikola Jokic versus Anthony Davis. Nikola Jokic, since they met in the playoffs last, has 2 MVPs on his belt. So he is a very, very different player compared to the player that the Lakers faced in the bubble in 2020. You look at, LeBron James is also a very different player compared to he was in the bubble. He's 38 now instead of 35 years old when he was in that bubble, which is crazy to say. It's crazy to even consider. But yes, he looks different. He's not the same 30. He's not as spry as he once was. The Lakers roster is very, very different compared to what it was in the bubble. You look at, the new additions of Austin Reeves. There's no Kyle Kuzma. There's no KCP. KCP is actually on the other side of the court playing for the Denver Nuggets. But yeah, the rotation looks completely different for this Lakers team. The rotation also looks completely different for this Nuggets team. They do have their core, though, of Jamal Murray, of Michael Porter Jr., of Nikola Jokic, but the surrounding pieces are different. Aaron Gordon wasn't there. KCP wasn't there. Bruce Brown wasn't there. Christian Brown wasn't there. So I think these teams do look very, very different compared to what they were in the bubble. Their nucleuses are the same. Although those nucleuses have also adapted and evolved. So it's hard to look at that bubble and say we will have the same result because so much has changed through 3 seasons, whether it be Anthony Davis and, LeBron James getting older, whether it be Nikola Jokic turning into one of the best players in the NBA, 2-time MVP, Jamal Murray being healthy. Like there's a lot of different wrinkles to both of these teams that weren't there in 2020 when they played for the Western Conference title. How do you lean given that? Where do you, I think, by the way, it's funny we're talking about both of these series because it is a top seed playing against the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference and a top seed playing against the 7th seed in the Western Conference.
Which is what you said. You said at the beginning of this, is there a world in which the teams at the bottom of the playoff standings, playoff picture are the more dangerous teams. And look where we
Yeah.
are now.
Yeah, look at where we are now. Man, Lauren, I appreciate you
We
saying
know a
that.
thing or two. We know a thing or
Gassing us
two.
up. Yeah. We get a thing or two right on here. I know we have a segment called Let's Be Idiots, but we get a couple things right. Where do you land on Lakers and Nuggets? Where do you land on that?
I lean Denver for all the reasons that since we started this podcast, the reason that I buy into teams, Denver they have just continued to check the boxes and given me reason to believe that this is their year. And so it's going to be tough. The Anthony Davis Jokic battle is going to be very tough, but I think Jamal Murray is going to have himself a series. I struggle to see, the Lakers have a lot of size, and that's great, which is why I think the battle with Jokic is going to be so significant and huge. But you can only you're not gonna mitigate Jokic, but the game plan that you're throwing at him is going to be so catered to him that I think Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. the opportunity is going to be there for them, and it's really going to be a matter of how aggressive and how consistent can you be. And I think that's more of a question for Michael Porter Jr. But I think that Jamal Murray and what we've seen Jamal Murray do in the playoffs, not just this year, but throughout his entire career, I think those two are really going to have big performances throughout this series. And someone like Aaron Gordon, I think, is also going to help with the Anthony Davis aggression and the interior presence, because the Lakers are, with their size, are going to be attacking the paint, and they're going to be expecting to just battle down there, especially with someone like Jokic in there, just hanging in there. And even try to pull him out to really have, someone just maximize the points in the paint battle. So I think it's going to be really interesting, but because of the depth, because of the evolution that you mentioned of Michael Porter Jr. and how he has grown since this, last rematch, same with even Jamal Murray and just the level that we're seeing Jokic play at. Right. I think the rotation guys, the Bruce Brown, the Christian Brown, Brown, like you mentioned, all of these guys, I think I favor them more than I favor the Lakers guys. As I've mentioned, I think it was in the Phoenix series that for the same reasons that I leaned Denver.
Yeah. So, okay. The Suns, I agree. You actually brought up something, and I kind of had a euphoria, whatever.
Eureka, I think is right.
Eureka. We are all over the place with word choices today. Certainty of certainty, or whatever it was.
The vocabulary here is incredible.
Killing it. Okay. I think you brought up a point of how the Lakers are going to guard Nikola Jokic. And I think a lot of the series begins there, because if you look at what the Suns did, the Suns decided at the start of the series to send a bunch of help towards Nikola Jokic. Well, okay, that opened up a ton of space for his teammates. Michael Porter Jr. caught fire. KCP got fire. Aaron Gordon, Jamal Murray, obviously. That is the worst way, in my opinion, to play a guy like Nikola Jokic, who is such a good passer, one of the greatest passing players of all time. Not even big man, passing players, just playmaker in general. Nikola Jokic is one of the best of all time. So to be able to send a double team to him or show help, that will cause troubles for you defensively. And I think the best way to guard this Nuggets team is to guard Nikola Jokic straight up, to play him one-on-one, force him to be a scorer, force him to be a guy who has to put pressure on the offense. And while Jokic did that against the Suns, he scored 50 in a game. He's been incredible offensively. He was able to do that against the Timberwolves because, Rudy Gobert isn't that kind of mobile defender. This is the biggest test for Jokic because Anthony Davis is the immovable object on the other side that is going to be able to stop you one-on-one. He's one of the only players in the NBA that I would say, you know what, man? I like that. I like that matchup. One-on-one, let's do AD versus Jokic. If Jokic can score 50 on him, okay, then fine. The Nuggets can win this series. But other way, we are confident in Anthony Davis, who is, by the way, played like a surefire defensive player of the year candidate throughout these playoffs. If AD played the defense he played in these playoffs throughout the regular season and played the requisite amount of minutes in games, I think Anthony Davis would have been the consensus, unanimous defensive player of the year. That's how good he's been. He would have been the defensive player of the year over Jaren Jackson, over Brook Lopez. That's genuinely how good Anthony Davis has been defensively for this team. So I think if you're going to go and think about defensive strategies, playing one-on-one is the way to go for the Lakers. But then that creates a caveat for the Lakers because they have to match Jokic's minutes with AD's minutes.
Right.
And also, playing in altitude, we saw how the Warriors were able to gas Anthony Davis when he played an extended amount of minutes against the Warriors. I think one of those games where he played the entire second half. By the end of the second half, him and LeBron James were like, they look like string noodles. Like they were just dying on the bench. So exhaustion, getting Anthony Davis tired is going to be a plus for the Nuggets, because if you're going one-on-one and you're allowing, Jokic to go at AD all game offensively, it's going to make it much harder for Anthony Davis to exert all of his energy offensively and be the paint presence that they need him to be on the offensive end. So I think that's the biggest question, is which one of those gives and takes, which one of those falters for first. Is it going to be Anthony Davis getting tired, or is it going to be Jokic not being able to get his teammates involved and not being able to help, kind of get those guys going because of the fact that, they're letting him play one-on-one and they're staying home on shooters and whatnot. The other aspect of this is how much can you make Nikola Jokic work defensively? Like you mentioned, are you going to be bringing him up higher towards the level of the screen? Is Anthony Davis going to be forced to be more of a perimeter-oriented player in this series just to draw out Jokic so that the Lakers can attack the rim a little bit more? Jokic isn't some kind of crazy rim presence. He isn't Anthony Davis when it comes to the defensive end. And so I think the Lakers will have an easier task getting to the rim, getting to the basket than they did against the Warriors. And I think those are the things that kind of jump to mind of how this series is going to go. Again, advantage-wise, I agree with you. I think right now the Nuggets are in favor. They are the ones who have the advantage in the series. They have been the better team all season. They probably have the better rotation of players. They can trust a solid 7 or 8 guys. And I think that's where I would lean. I think this Lakers team could win this series.
I do too.
I think they could win more, like by a considerable amount. Like I believe in the Lakers much more than I do the Miami Heat to win their series.
Yes.
So
that's fair. I think the level that we're seeing, I mean, everybody has said it all starts and ends with Anthony Davis and the level that he's playing at. And we have no reason right now to believe that is going to stop. And I mean, on one hand, it's like, okay, well, the Lakers, you got Rui Hachimura, Anthony Davis, Jared Vanderbilt. They've got size. They've got guys to throw out there. Freaking LeBron James. But the Nuggets, Nikola Jokic, Aaron Gordon, Michael Porter Jr., they've got big guys as well. They also have Thomas Bryant, who, not necessarily a defensive presence, but another big guy to throw out there. So what I'm curious to see is, as the series goes on, who do the Lakers lean on? Because I'm with you. I think their best bet is to go one-on-one with Jokic and trust Anthony Davis, but matching the minutes. Not matching the minutes, AD getting tired, the altitude, what questions does that present? And then who do you go to? Do you try to go smaller? Do you go with a small ball lineup and try to outpace them, or try what do you try to go that route? Do you try and, I heard Chris Haynes mention today on the latest episode of their podcast that he expects to see Tristan Thompson in this series. Yeah. And so I'm very curious to see what lineup and rotation adjustments, maybe not even just personnel swaps, but like minutes, who does Jared Vanderbilt skyrocket? Do they throw out a small ball lineup? Because I think the Lakers will have options, which is not something that we have said a lot in the past, which is why I think that I will not be surprised if they come out of this series. But the last thing that I want to say, one of the last things you mentioned was AD. The question is, does AD get tired? Or on the other side, does Nikola Jokic have trouble incorporating and including his teammates and maximizing their capabilities? And I think we have plenty of evidence to believe that Nikola Jokic getting his teammates involved and setting them up, we have plenty of reason to believe that that's exactly what's going to happen. So I'm curious to see what adjustments the Lakers make and what they try to throw at them. But it's going to be good. It's going to be a close one, I think. Close one.
I agree. I think I would lean Nuggets in 6 or 7, but I do not feel confident in that at all.
Me either.
I could see Lakers in 6 or 7, and genuinely, it could be a very, very close series. I could see this going 7 very easily. Very, very easily. And, game 7, LeBron James, Anthony Davis, Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray. This is the closest the Nuggets have ever been to an NBA Finals since 2010. I want to say it was the year. It's 2009. It was either 2009 or 2010, but it was the year that they actually faced the Lakers, funny enough, in the conference finals. Kobe Bryant versus Carmelo Anthony. They had Chauncey Billups as well, the Nuggets did. And then, the Lakers ended up going on to win that series and then winning the NBA Finals as well. I can't remember if it was 2009 or 2010. Regardless, it was an incredible series between Melo and Kobe. The highlights you can go watch on YouTube. I remember when I was in high school, that was like one of my favorite series of all time to watch. I want to say it was 2009 because the Suns made it to the conference finals in 2010, I'm pretty sure, and they lost to the Lakers.
2009, lost Western Conference Finals.
Yes, that's the one. Yeah. Now that I'm remembering it, yes, it was 2010. The Channing. Yeah. I remember. Okay. Anyways, that's just me going through my NBA historian brain. Sorry, guys. That's what I do on a daily. But look, I would probably lean Nuggets, and I think that's probably the fair way to go. But I would not be surprised, ladies and gentlemen, if we end up getting a Lakers-Celtics NBA Finals 2023.
Imagine.
Yeah, it would be the first time since 2010. But yeah, it would be quite the series. It would be quite the series. And then on the other side, if it's Celtics Nuggets, you have two teams who are trying to win their first NBA title. Not the fact that the Celtics are trying to win their first NBA title, but Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are trying to win their first NBA title, and Nikola Jokic and Jamal Murray are trying to win their first NBA title. So the storylines are plentiful there. And let's say for some way, if the Heat end up making it to the NBA Finals again, and it's against the Nuggets or the Lakers, you have Jimmy Butler on the precipice of potentially his first ever NBA championship. The 8th seed, by the way, potentially in the NBA Finals again for the first time since 1999. So there is so many storylines, so many things that we could do. But there isn't a shortage of storylines, Lauren, because through all this conversation, we haven't really talked about the Ja Morant situation. And I wanted to kind of leave that to the end because, hey, this is the situation that we have kind of fell into. Sunday, there was another video that surfaced that Ja Morant was with a gun. The Grizzlies announced only maybe 2 or 3 hours later that he is suspended from all activities, Grizzlies activities, if you will. And I mean, to be honest with you, I think that's kind of a weird thing to do, especially because the Grizzlies are in the offseason. It's not like, Ja is going to be missing anything crazy. But again, that's the other thing. Before we get into this conversation, I want to talk about the racial elements of this because I think that's a very, very important point. I think the fact that if you were to look at the hypocritical way that society and especially America approaches guns, it's honestly, it's very, very comical because you look at, some people have mentioned the fact that there are senators and, Senate people, even a senator in Tennessee, the state that Ja Morant is in, who does Christmas cards with guns in his hands. So I think there is a little bit of a racial bias here when it comes to approaching and dissecting and criticizing a guy like Ja Morant for having a gun. He didn't do, as far as we know, there is nothing illegal to him having a gun. There is nothing illegal to him showing a gun. It was in a car from what I've seen, from what the video was. None of that is technically illegal. Right. And from an American society perspective, I think the way we have these conversations, the fact that like Ja Morant, a black man, is being targeted and kind of destroyed, if you will. People are saying his career should end for having a gun. And then on the other side of things, you have, these senators and these congressmen who are just be chilling. I think that is incredibly hypocritical. That being said, what Ja Morant did was incredibly stupid. And I don't think there's any denying that. I think there is the fact that Ja Morant messed up. And then 2 months later, after being suspended, after being ridiculed, after doing the interview with Jalen Rose, he ends up in the same situation. Nothing has changed. None of that rehabilitation. Apparently he had went to a rehabilitation place, when he was first suspended a couple of months ago, and nothing has changed in that department. So I think there's two ways to approach this, and I think they're both very. I wouldn't say they're different ways. I think there's two discussions to be had here. There's the American society perspective, and I would love to get your perspective on that because obviously you live in America, you live in Texas, which is obviously, And then on the other side of that, it's the fact that Ja Morant, given the stakes, given where he's at in his career, given that he is a role model to many, many people, made a stupid decision again. And he is continuing to make very, very stupid decisions.
Right.
So I guess where do you sit on it all?
Oh boy. Well, it's a very complicated issue, but I'm really glad you brought up Tennessee and the gun laws and just the state specific government structure there, because Tennessee has some of, if not the most loose restrictions on gun law, on gun control, all things guns in general. And not only is it one of, if not the most loosely just restricted, they're actively trying to loosen the restrictions on gun. Like it's a problem. It's a massive problem. And so that is a separate conversation. But another part to all of this, and a part that was discussed in the Jalen Rose interview and conversation, was the people around Ja Morant, or are we, and I'm not talking about like his family and friends, I'm talking about the NBA as a whole. I think there's a conversation to be had there, because there's nothing specific that I have to base this off of. This is just what I kind of envision based off of some of the other players throughout history who have maybe done something that is not great in the public eye, or have been arrested and get let right back in like nothing ever happened. I think there's a much bigger conversation to be had there. And I would not be surprised, and this is not, specific to the Memphis Grizzlies or anything, but I would not be surprised if there were people in Ja Morant's ear saying, hey, do what you're going to do, just don't post it online. I would not be surprised at all if there were a number of people that have said that to Ja Morant and his camp, and along with several other NBA players throughout history. And so I think there's a larger conversation to be had. I think there's absolutely racial bias taking place, and it's not fair. So I mean, there are several conversations to be had. I think Ja Morant, when this happens, and then not even how many months has it been? Like
it's been less than 2 months.
Yeah, less than 2 months. That is like, come on. But
it's disheartening.
It's really disheartening. That's a good way to put it.
Because Ja Morant is a superstar in the NBA. He has his own shoe deal with Nike. He has the Jaws that they're great shoes. I mean, everybody at All-Star Weekend was going after these shoes. The NBA is propping him up to be one of the future faces of the league. He's obviously one of the top American basketball players. That's another thing to consider here, is that Ja Morant is an American, and the league right now is a league that is international. You have Giannis, you have Jokic, you have Embiid, you have guys who are international players. Wembanyama is going to be coming into the league. And Ja Morant is a guy that he's going to appeal to an American audience. He's the guy who's going to be in these Nike commercials. He's the guy who's going to be in these other commercials that they prop up and put out there. If he is the guy that you are building around, building a brand around, you cannot also have him make these types of decisions. Right. You cannot also make him be this, again, it's a very, very stupid thing that he did. I think the backlash and the way that he's been criticized about this is fair, but I also think that there is a level of racial bias when it comes to that, because if this was a white player,
what's crazy is that there's never been that. There's never been that. There's never been that level of ridicule. There just hasn't. It's not like those things aren't taking place. You know what I mean? Exactly. And so that's where if anyone out there is like, well, no, bottom line, this is wrong. Bottom line, this is wrong. There's absolutely a conversation to be had about racial bias, because how many players outside of the Myers-Leonard situation in recent history can you name that are white that have gone through this level of public ridicule? Right. I don't think you can.
It's the way it's being discussed is the thing here. I think everybody can agree that what Ja did was stupid,
wrong. Yeah.
But I think the way it's being discussed, the way people are making it out to be that he should be losing his career, that he should be losing his sponsorships, et cetera, because of this, is okay. Now let's flip the switch here. Let's say if he was a white NBA player who started a YouTube channel to talk about his love for rifles. Okay, how would the conversation be different at that point, right?
Especially in Tennessee, automatic rifles in Tennessee. Yes, you know what I mean? Completely. That's his free speech. That's his, look where he lives. That's what the conversation would be.
Right. So I think the way we discuss these things, you always have to be one, objective basketball podcast, but also you have to recognize your own biases. We had this conversation with Iman I would say 2 months ago when it came to the Ja Morant situation before, and to come and look at it 2 months later and see how much he's being put under fire. I think there is a portion of that is fair. I think there is some real genuine discussions to have about him as the face of the league and the people around him, like you mentioned. But then there also is this other conversation about how we really just put down the racial bias aspect of things. Essentially is what I'm talking about here, is like, look at the way people discuss these certain things. Try to observe, for the people who are listening to this podcast, try to observe the way that people are talking about these things. Try to observe what will happen if something else were to happen that is completely different from this, and see the difference. Look at the difference. Approach and try to realize your own biases as well. And I think that's a really, really important thing to move forward with. Anything you want to add before we head
I'm glad you said that. Like, just try and observe and like think about the bias, because it's not that, we all have inherent biases. And so it's not that, you recognize a bias, you're a terrible person, or you're this or you're that. That's not what it is. It's, okay, as I'm taking in something as a member of society, if I recognize that, I have been conditioned to react or think this way, then just recognize that, is there a better way, or is that not fair to that person? And I think that is a really good starting place for a lot of conversations that need to be had today and also moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. All right, folks. Listen, thank you so much for tapping into a rather long episode of the Objective Basketball Podcast. We didn't even talk about the draft lottery. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but we will be breaking it down for you once it goes down. It's going to be an insane night with Victor Wembanyama, and we'll see what happens. Who knows? I mean,
I'm getting so pumped. Oh my God.
Just get excited thinking about it. It's funny because, like you mentioned at the top of the podcast, the draft lottery is a 30-minute thing. It's so quick. It moves so fast. You don't even remember it after
half the league's not watching.
Half the league's not watching because they're focused on the playoffs or focused on themselves. It's just such an incredible the stakes are incredibly high, and for a player like Victor Wembanyama, the stakes are elevated to the umpteenth percent. Like, it's just not even recognizable at that point. The hype is going to be unreal. They're doing like an hour countdown before the draft lottery, which is just so funny to consider because it's a 30-minute event.
Right.
All they do is pull out envelopes. That's what the thing is. But it implies the future and has stakes for a million, different franchises. What happens with the Houston Rockets, the Detroit Pistons, the San Antonio Spurs, the Hornets, the Portland Trailblazers. There's other teams like Dallas Mavericks and Toronto Raptors. And, hey, things could get interesting. We've seen it happen before. It can really, really get crazy if one of those teams jump. We'll see what happens. We will do a podcast on Thursday, talk about it. We've got a cool guest coming on as well that will be able to shed some light on it, so that will be interesting. But once again, we appreciate you guys for listening to the Objective Basketball Podcast. From Lauren and myself, we will see you later.
Follow hosts at Just S Baraheni on all socials and at the Lauren Gunn on Twitter. The Objective Basketball Podcast, delivering the NBA to you like no other.